Mongolian history is absolutely fascinating, but is dominated by that Temujin guy. Understandably too, he did forge an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Europe. But Mongolia is more than just steppe warriors and their horses. The story of Mongolia's existence under communism is arguably one of the Cold War's most fascinating tales, although one that seems to be rather underexplored compared to the other well-documented histories of other countries like Vietnam or North Korea in Asia's Eastern Bloc. I'm your host David, and today we are going to start looking at the 20th century history of Mongolia. This is the Cold War. When most people think of Mongolia, they think of its vast steppe, the stunning mountains and forests, and nomadic traditions. The more historically minded will, of course, recall Temujin, Genghis Khan, the ambitious leader of the Mongol Empire who wreaked havoc across Asia and Europe in the 13th century and established the largest continuous territorial empire in history. However, I am willing to bet that far fewer people are aware that the Cold War saw Mongolia caught up in the very center of 20th century geopolitics and great power competition. Many even think that communist Mongolia was merely a constituent republic of the Soviet Union, but again, this was not the case. So, what is the story of Mongolia's time as a communist state? How did the Mongolian People's Republic come to be, and why was it so integral to the story of the Cold War in Asia? Let's now explore the history of the Mongolian People's Republic. As we alluded to in the introduction, the history of Mongolia in the pre-modern and early modern period is deeply rich and complex. But for the sake of brevity, after being conquered in the 17th century by the Manchus, the land of the Mongols was divided into Inner and Outer Mongolia, with most of Outer Mongolia forming what is today recognized as the state of Mongolia. Outer Mongolia traditionally had much more autonomy than Inner Mongolia, and after the 1911 collapse of the Qing dynasty in China, Outer Mongolia began asserting its right to nationhood. However, Mongolia was seized again by the Republic of China in 1919. The same year, Bolshevik forces in civil war-stricken Russia had recognized Mongolia's independence, so Mongolian revolutionaries got in contact with Bolsheviks in Siberia, seeking assistance against the Chinese. Subsequently, Russian soldiers arrived in Mongolia in the winter of 1920, and by February 4th, 1921, Chinese forces had been driven out. So, the Mongolian revolutionaries in question were led by a figure called Damdin Sukhbatar, who in 1920 founded the Mongolian People's Republic, or MPP. Following Mongolia's Russian-backed victory over the Chinese, the MPP established a provisional government as its first Congress on the 1st of March, 1921. Later that year, in July, Sukhbatar, supported by Soviet troops, gained full control of the territory and established the MPR, the Mongolian People's Republic. So far so good, right? Well, caught between Russia and China, and with its autonomy under threat, the MPP was quickly marred by internal divisions between staunch communists and nationalists. With the help of the Soviets, though, in January 1922, the leader of the nationalist faction, Dogsimin Bodu, was forced to resign. In August, he was executed as a counter-revolutionary. After Sukhbatar's death in 1923, the MPP program was amended so that the party could be completely purged of nationalist elements, and by 1924, the MPP was principally under the control of the communists. The MPP was renamed the Mongolian People's Revolutionary Party, or MPRP, and it joined the Comintern. The capital, Nomenkuri, was also renamed to Ulaanbaatar that same year. Despite the purge, several nationalist figures did remain in the MPRP, and in these early years, they managed to maintain considerable influence, especially over Mongolia's economic affairs. They initially promoted the slogan, "Get Rich," to promote small-scale business in a program similar to Lenin's New Economic Policy, which characterized the Soviet economy at the time. Obviously, the communists hated this, but luckily for them anyway, they remained far more influential politically. As a result, in 1926, the Fifth Party Congress called for the restriction and nationalization of private property, while the Seventh Party Congress in 1928 denounced what it called the nationalists' right opportunism and subsequently dismissed several leaders. By the late 1920s then, the communist control of the MPRP was becoming increasingly solidified. Relatedly, by that point in time, Joseph Stalin had gained unopposed control of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, so the MPRP increasingly looked to him for inspiration. Stalin wanted Mongolia to transition from the democratic to the socialist stage of the communist revolution, and so in 1929, the Mongolian state began expropriating monastery property. It also forced herdsmen into collective farms and communes in a process akin to Stalin's collectivization of agriculture in the USSR. This was unpopular enough that it resulted in several armed uprisings against the leftist policies of the MPRP from 1930 to 1932, which became collectively known as the Huvsgul Uprising. Principally led by the lamas of the Buddhist faith, it resulted in the deaths of over 1,500 people as Soviet-backed Mongolian troops quelled the uprising. Over the duration of the Huvsgul Uprising, it's estimated that 1/3 of Mongolian livestock was decimated, while over 800 properties belonging to the nobility and Buddhist church were confiscated. Additionally, over 700 heads of noble households were executed. In response to the uprising, Moscow ordered the MPRP to curtail its unpopular initiatives and pinned the blame on hardline leftists within the party. This resulted in several more high-profile expulsions from the party in May 1932. Throughout the mid-1930s, the MPRP scaled back its persecution of religious leaders and its attempts at collectivization. But the horrors quickly resumed as Horlujin Choibalsan, a leading figure of Mongolia's communist revolution of the 1920s, sought to establish himself as the outright leader of the MPRP. With Moscow's assistance, and again in lockstep with Stalin's own approach to governance, the Soviet NKVD helped Choibalsan to instigate a series of purges against leading figures in the MPRP in order to secure his own position. As summarized by Professor Christopher Kaplonski, quote, under the direction of his Soviet handler, Matvei Petrovich Chopyak, Choibalsan had Internal Affairs Committee rules amended in May 1936 to facilitate the detention of high-ranking politicians without first consulting political superiors. Soon thereafter, 23 high-ranking lamas were arrested. Following a year-long trial, they were publicly executed in early October 1937. In the 2-year period between 1937 and 1939, anywhere between 20,000 and 35,000 so-called enemies of the revolution were executed, including numerous high-ranking government figures and members of the intelligentsia. Though nowhere close to the millions killed under Stalin, this still amounted to between 3 and 5% of Mongolia's population at the time, and is hugely significant. Amid all the purging, Choibalsan decided he was stressed and spent 6 months relaxing in Sochi in the USSR, mingling with senior Soviet officials, including Stalin himself. When Choibalsan returned to Mongolia and ended the purge in April 1939, he did so as uncontested leader, simultaneously holding the title of Prime Minister, Minister of Internal Affairs, Minister of War, and Commander-in-Chief of the Mongolian Armed Forces. He also claimed that the purge had been overzealously conducted while he was away in the USSR, an attempt to absolve and distance himself of any guilt. At this point, it does seem worth asking though, if Choibalsan and the MPRP were so close to the USSR in the 1920s and 30s, why didn't Mongolia just join the USSR at the same time the Soviets were expanding their influence in nearby Central Asia? Well, the answer is actually fairly simple. Effectively, the Soviets wanted to avoid a war with China, and to a lesser extent with Japan, something whose chances would have increased significantly had Mongolia been incorporated into the USSR. As a result, the Soviets enthusiastically supported Mongolia's communist development, but stopped short of offering it full republic status. Still though, questions regarding Mongolia's sovereignty and its place in the world came to the fore with the Soviets' entry into the Second World War. Though Mongolia did not officially join the Soviet war effort, it promised to provide assistance in the form of volunteers and materiel, and its economy was mobilized to reflect this. The most important wartime development for Mongolia, however, was almost certainly at the Yalta Conference in May 1945. Indeed, at this time, Mongolia was still broadly recognized internationally as part of China. But with Great Britain and the US in particular seeking the Soviets' help in the war against Japan, the Soviets sought the recognition of the status quo in Mongolia as a precondition for their assistance. This was accepted by the Allies, and Mongolia gained de facto international recognition. The Soviets subsequently used Mongolia as a base for their war on Japan, which saw around 650,000 Soviet troops stationed in the country. Shortly after this, the Soviets persuaded the Republic of China to recognize what was once Outer Mongolia as independent when Stalin promised not to support the Chinese Communist Party in the ongoing Chinese Civil War. This resulted in the signature of the 1945 Sino-Soviet Treaty. An independence referendum was then held in the Mongolian People's Republic in October 1945. Oddly enough, 100% of voters, yes, you heard me right, 100% opted for independence, with 0 votes registered against the notion anywhere in the entire country. Historian Sergey Radchenko described the referendum as regarded by both sides as political theater due to the peculiarity of a supposed unanimous 100% vote in favor. Still though, these wartime developments were huge for Mongolia and granted it legitimacy on the international stage. Mongolia then entered the Cold War in relatively good shape. It had avoided the devastation of war, secured its independence, and the USSR was willing to support it economically and politically. It's puzzling then that for all the vicious purges against nationalists instigated by Choi Balsan and his predecessors, many Mongolian politicians were seriously enthusiastic about reuniting the MPR with Inner Mongolia. However, when the Chinese Communist Party won the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, this made the MPRP's ambitions far more complicated. As you would expect, Mongolia transferred its recognition of the Chinese state from the Republic of China to the PRC, but what would China's turn to communism mean for Mongolia's sovereignty? Like Choi Balsan, Chinese leader Mao Zedong also hoped to unify Outer and Inner Mongolia. He, however, wanted Mongolia to join the new People's Republic. From their position of post-war strength, however, Soviet leadership flatly refused when Mao tried to raise the question in 1949. For example, during a secret consultation with senior Chinese officials, Soviet diplomat Anastas Mikoyan told Mao directly that Mongolia had, quote, long grown accustomed to the taste of independence and was unlikely ever to surrender that independence voluntarily. According to the transcript of the meeting, Mao backtracked and replied that he did not defend the Great Han chauvinistic line and would not raise the question of Mongolia's reunification again. It wasn't long after this that Stalin and Mao signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance on the 14th of February 1950. Stalin wanted to limit the potential for the PRC to encroach on the Soviet sphere of influence, especially in East Asia, so as part of the agreement, Stalin made the PRC guarantee the MRP's independence from China. But the treaty also recognized Inner Mongolia as part of China, putting Choi Balsan's hopes of reuniting the MPR with Inner Mongolia completely to bed, as he was utterly reliant on Soviet support. Despite this, after Stalin's death, the Chinese twice more raised the Mongolian issue. Once in a still classified conversation with Nikita Khrushchev in the fall of 1954, and a second time in a conversation with Mikoyan in April 1956. According to Sergey Radchenko, quote, the record of Mikoyan's April 1956 meeting with senior CCP Politburo member Liu Shaoqi and Premier Zhao Enlai shows how the Chinese leadership hoped to connect Mongolia with the question of Stalin's mistakes and thereby cancel its independence in the wake of Khrushchev's condemnation of Stalin's personality cult. Liu drew a parallel between Mongolia and Ukraine, with Mongolia being China's Ukraine. Radchenko goes on to suggest that Chinese claims on Mongolia did nothing to strengthen proletarian solidarity between the two parties. In any case, Choi Balsan died of cancer in Moscow in 1952 and was replaced as prime minister by Yumjaegin Tsedenbal, the MPRP's general secretary, and had been second in command to Choi Balsan. Unlike Choi Balsan, however, Tsedenbal was enthusiastic about bringing Mongolia into the Soviet Union, so he started raising this issue despite the fact that it had been clearly off the table since at least the late 1920s. Tsedenbal both formally and informally asked the USSR to annex it at least 6 times, and every single time the answer was no. And the reason? Well, by this point, even though the USSR's issues with China had been mostly settled, the USSR was getting everything it needed from Mongolia without the trouble of integrating it fully. It got a buffer zone with China, and Moscow could hold the Mongolia issue over Beijing's head as a bargaining chip if it ever needed to. Moreover, the MPRP's leadership was largely bereft of any real willingness to give up Mongolia's sovereignty. This once again showed that tensions between nationalist camps and more orthodox communist camps in the party had still not disappeared completely. Still, these developments in the 1950s paved the way for the MPR's relations with the PRC to improve somewhat. During this period, the Chinese went on a charm offensive towards the Mongolians, with Mao receiving a Mongolian delegation in September 1956. Mao said that our ancestors exploited you for 300 years, and outlined that the Chinese sought to repay our debt to the Mongolian people. In 1949, the Trans-Mongolian Railway was opened, connecting Ulaanbaatar to Moscow via the Trans-Siberian Railway. This was then extended to the Chinese border and was later linked with Beijing in 1955. China promised to send between 100 and 300,000 workers to Mongolia, but the prospect of this was daunting for Tsedenbal, given that Mongolia's population at the time was just 800,000 people. Was such a huge inflow of Chinese workers intended as a fifth column against the MPR? Radchenko suggests that the Sino-Mongolian friendship resembled a cat-and-mouse game, with Mao privately pushing levers to return the former province back to China. Tsedenbal's hesitation certainly suggests that the MPRP saw things this way. Luckily though, China did not take immediate steps, and Mao instead encouraged the MPRP to focus on eradicating their nation's nomadic heritage and speeding up industrialization before providing more tangible support. Thus, though Tsedenbal and the MPRP remained wary of the nature of China's overtures, at this point they were in a position where they could resist Mao's more insidious ambitions under the protection of Soviet support for Mongolia's sovereignty. In the early 1960s, however, Mongolia's relationship with China was characterized by a sharp decline, linked directly to the Sino-Soviet split, as the Mongolians had little choice but to back the Soviets. Or did they? In the same period, other communist countries, namely North Korea, Albania, and Romania, all exercised a degree of sovereignty within the international communist world, maintaining arm's-length relations with both Moscow and Beijing. Yet, given Mongolia's historical relationship with both Russia and China, its choice was unsurprising. As promised, Mao had sent some Chinese workers to Mongolia in the late 1950s, albeit only 8,000 to 10,000 of them. When Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai met with Tsedenbal in December 1962 for what turned out to be the final time, they clashed heads and Zhou withdrew the Chinese workers out of Mongolia. But to suggest that Ulaanbaatar merely followed Moscow's line on Beijing would be unfair to the MRP. If anything, the Mongolian leadership was actually much more critical. For instance, Khrushchev actually continued supporting China on its ongoing border disagreement with India amid the split, much to the disappointment of Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Khrushchev even said of China, quote, "In relations between us, there is no place for neutrality. This would be a betrayal. We shall always be in one camp and share joys and sorrows." Tsedenbal, by contrast, wrote in his diary in 1963 that, quote, "The Chinese are preaching feudal isolation. However, their goal is different. In reality, they want to make other countries into their satellites." Nevertheless, Tsedenbal, who was caught between the great powers of the USSR and China, was not really in a position where he could truly express the MPR's position. Having said that, the split did make Mongolia's role as a Soviet ally much more important, and this yielded considerable benefits both internationally and domestically. In July 1963, Mongolia thus applied for membership of the Warsaw Pact, citing its desire for modern weaponry and technology. While Mongolia was only granted observer status, and thus not formally admitted, this status nevertheless afforded Mongolia Moscow's tacit military support. Indeed, a buildup of Chinese troops on the Mongolian border in late 1965 prompted Tsedenbal to ask Leonid Brezhnev for direct assistance when he visited Ulaanbaatar in January 1966. This was granted in February of 1967 when the Soviet Politburo adopted Resolution P2332OP on stationing Soviet forces on the territory of the MPR. By March 1968, the USSR had stationed around 800 Soviet Army tanks and 100,000 troops in Mongolia. In the context of the Cold War then, Ulaanbaatar's close relationship with Moscow thus afforded it both a guarantor of its independence against an increasingly irredentist China and unprecedented strategic importance in Moscow's split with Beijing. So, while Mongolia's foreign policy had developed in almost complete alignment with the USSR's since the end of the Second World War, its political system had taken a slightly different turn. Indeed, unlike the post-Stalin thaw in the USSR, the death of Choi Bal-sun, who you will remember is the man who had instigated all these Stalinist purges of the 1930s, did not prove to be a watershed moment in Mongolian politics. Though Choi Bal-sun's personality cult did come under criticism at the April 1956 plenum of the Central Committee of the MPRP, Tsedenbal was cautiously negative about a Mongolian thaw. Amid growing criticism of his leadership in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Tsedenbal instigated yet another purge against his rivals, though he stopped short of executing them. Instead, several high-profile political rivals were forced into exile, including First Secretary of the MPRP Dashin Damba in 1959 and fellow Politburo member Damarin Tomor-Ochir in 1962 on charges of nationalism. In 1964, a whole host of others known as the Anti-Party Group, who were inspired by Brezhnev's coup against Khrushchev, decided to overthrow Tsedenbal but were defeated and exiled. Thus, when Brezhnev visited Ulaanbaatar in 1966 to offer Moscow's military support, Tsedenbal presided unchallenged over the 15th Party Congress. With these purges, then, Tsedenbal was free to build a cult of personality around himself, one that would characterize both the lives of ordinary Mongolians and the domestic political system until his fall in 1984. But as we've seen in today's episode, until the mid-1960s at least, Mongolia's development was largely defined by its relations with the USSR and with China. Certainly the MPR would likely not have survived without the Soviets' help, and the MPRP's ruthless approach to dissent within the party was largely facilitated by the Soviets. Perhaps surprisingly, the Second World War and the subsequent Chinese Civil War catapulted Mongolia into the throes of Cold War geopolitics, turning it from a mere Soviet satellite state into a key battleground for influence amidst one of the communist world's most crucial turning points, the Sino-Soviet split. But as Tsedenbal's triumph against his opponents in the 1960s alludes, in the aftermath, Mongolia was increasingly developing its own political identity that would set it on a somewhat divergent path from its Soviet neighbor. This path, however, will be explored in a future episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you press the like button and subscribe. And if you are somebody who objected to my use of the word decimate in this episode to mean anything other than 1 in 10, please realize that languages evolve and change over time, including the definitions of words. Press the bell button anyways. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.